SIG-23 is 21 December 2020. This is actually part one of the three-part series about Palantir, the rollout of the COVID vaccination, and the panopticon of healthcare. So, with that, this is from Jeremy Lafredo and Whitney Webb. This is actually dated 25 November 2020. Johns Hopkins and the CDC plan to mask medical experimentation on minorities as racial justice. Under the guise of combating structural racism, the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security has laid out a strategy for ethnic minorities and the mentally challenged to be vaccinated first, all as a matter of justice. However, other claims made by the center contradict these social justice talking points and point to other motives entirely. When the first COVID-19 vaccination candidate set to receive an emergency use authorization from the U.S. government in a matter of days, remember this is dated 25 November, its distribution and allocation is set to begin within 24 hours of that vaccine's imminent approval. The allocation strategy of COVID-19 vaccines within the U.S. is set to dramatically differ from previous national vaccination programs. One key difference is that the vaccine effort itself, known as Operation Warp Speed, is being almost completely managed by the U.S. military. Along with the Department of Homeland Security and the National Security Agency, is opposed to civilian health agencies, which are significantly less involved than previous national vaccination efforts and have even been barred from attending some warp speed meetings. In addition, for the first time since 2001, law enforcement officers and DHS officials are set to not be prioritized for early vaccination. It's interesting. Another key difference is the plan to utilize a phased approach that targets populations of focus identified in advance by different government organizations, including the CDC's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, or ACIP. Characteristics of those populations of focus, also referred to as critical populations in official documentation, will then be identified by the secretive Palantir-developed software tool known as Tiberius to guide Operation Warp Speed's vaccine distribution efforts. Tiberius will provide Palantir access to sensitive health and demographic data of Americans, which the company will use to help identify high-priority populations at highest risk of infection. This report is the first of a three-part series unmasking the racist components of the Pentagon-run project to both develop and distribute a COVID-19 vaccine. It explores the COVID-19 vaccine allocation strategy first outlined by the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security and subsequent government allocation strategies that were informed by Johns Hopkins. The main focus of this allocation strategy is to deliver vaccines first to racial minorities, but in such a way as to make those minorities feel at ease and not like guinea pigs when receiving an experimental vaccine that those documents admit is likely to cause certain adverse effects more frequently in certain population groups, and research has shown that those subgroups are more at risk for adverse effects are these same minorities. The documents also acknowledge that information warfare and economic coercion will be necessary to combat vaccine hesitancy among these minority groups. It even frames this clearly disproportionate focus on racial minorities as related to national concerns over police brutality, claiming that giving minorities the experimental vaccine first is necessary to combat structural racism, whatever that is, and ensure fairness and justice in the healthcare system and society at large. Part 2 of this series will discuss how Palantir, a company currently helping DHS and law enforcement violently target African Americans and Latinos, will be in charge of allocating tailored, quote-unquote, COVID-19 vaccines to those same minorities, as well as Palantir's origins and its executives' views on race. Part 3 will explore the direct ties between a COVID-19 vaccine frontrunner, and the Eugenics Society, which was renamed the Galton Institute in 1989. So, the planners. The Trump administration has been criticized for its rush to develop and deploy a COVID-19 vaccine, and particularly for installing Monclef Slaoui, Slaoui, a former pharmaceutical executive with ongoing conflicts of interest, as chief scientific advisor for Operation Warp Speed, the Pentagon-run program to produce and distribute the vaccine. Yet, if and when a Biden administration takes over, Operation Warp Speed is set to proceed with little, if any, modification. The Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, CHS, Director Tom Inglesby, who will serve on the Biden Health and Human Services transition team, has praised Slaoui, telling Stat News that the longer someone like him can remain in charge of the nation's COVID-19 vaccine effort, the better it is for the country. Inglesby, who led discussions at CHS's Event 201 exercise in October 2019, and who was one of the primary authors of the controversial Johns Hopkins Dark Winter exercise in 2001, is emblematic of the U.S. government's and the mainstream media's general reliance on the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, of which CHS is part, for pandemic-related matters. Slaoui regularly appears on network TV as a COVID-19 oracle and has been called one of the nation's go-to experts on the spread of the coronavirus. Readers may note that the Johns Hopkins Coronavirus Tracker has been used by virtually every mainstream news source since the beginning of COVID-19 reporting. This relationship is expected to continue, if not intensify, in a Biden administration. Both Kathleen Hicks, the lead of Biden's Department of Defense transition team, and Alexander Bick on Biden's National Security Council transition team are scholars at Johns Hopkins Kissinger Center for Global Affairs, so that's promising, reflecting the university's broader influence on a future Biden administration. Yet, the most significant way the Biden transition team intersects with Johns Hopkins is through the CHS. Originally called the Center for Civilian Biodefense Strategies, the CHS is a think tank within Johns Hopkins that regularly gives recommendations to both the U.S. government and the World Health Organization, and, like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, has emerged as a voice of authority on all matters COVID-19 in the U.S. The center's founding director was D.A. Henderson, best known for his role in the WHO-sponsored smallpox vaccination campaign. Henderson also held several government positions, including serving as Associate Director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy under George H.W. Bush. He was also the longtime Dean of the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. Another member of the Biden transition team is Luciana Borio, a current member of the CHS Steering Committee. As both a former FDA scientist and former National Security Council member, Borio signifies the relationship between the national security state and the biosecurity state. She is currently a vice president of In-Q-Tel, the venture capital arm of the CIA. In-Q-Tel's current executive vice president, Tara O'Toole, who at the onset of the COVID-19 outbreak declared that, quote, the best way ever to protect those who are well is with vaccines, end quote, is Ingleby's mentor and predecessor as director of the CHS. She was also a key player and the lead author of the CHS's Dark Winter and, what is this? Chicade X? Clada X? What the hell is this? Bioterror Simulations. Let's see. Let's try this. Just a minute. All right. The Engineering Contagion series, published by The Last American Vagabond earlier this year explored the Dark Winter simulation in depth, including how the simulation eerily predicted the 2001 anthrax attacks that followed soon after September 11, 2001, with several participants demonstrating apparent foreknowledge of those attacks. I'm going to have to look into those. Ending racism with vaccines? The Center for Disease Control and Prevention has consistently referenced materials developed by the CHS in its recent COVID-19 vaccine allocation literature. These CDC-issued materials form the backbone of the various vaccine allocation strategies issued by many state governments. Chief among these is the COVID-19 vaccination program interim playbook published at the end of October. A key aspect of that program is the determination of critical populations for COVID-19 vaccination, including those groups identified to receive the first available doses of COVID-19 vaccine when supply is expected to be limited. In August, the CHS published its Inglesby co-written interim framework for COVID-19 vaccine allocation and distribution, which is cited by the CDC as a reference for its nationwide COVID-19 vaccine allocation strategy. This report will examine this document in particular, as well as other related documents that reveal that ethnic and racial minorities, specifically those over 65 and those who make up part of the essential workforce, are set to be the first to receive experimental COVID-19 vaccines. The interim framework argues that there is a need to prioritize ethnic minorities, particularly African Americans and Latino Americans, in order to reflect fairness and justice. It states that a critical difference between COVID-19 vaccine allocations and the context envisioned in the 2018 guidance for pandemic influenza vaccine allocation is the fact that the U.S. is currently in the midst of a national reckoning on racial justice, prompted by cases of police brutality and murder. It goes on to state that although structural racism was as present in the 2018 and previous influenza pandemics as it is today, the general public acknowledgement of racial injustice was not. Yeah. And burning down cities will help bring that to the fore, won't it? It goes without saying that police brutality is decidedly unrelated to vaccine allocation, as is increased national awareness of racial injustice as it relates to police brutality. This is further compounded by the police in this document being removed as a priority group for COVID-19 vaccine allocation, despite having been designated as a priority group in all other government vaccine allocation guidance since the 2001 anthrax attacks. Also odd is that it is only increased access of minorities to the COVID-19 vaccine that is cited as a way to address structural racism in health systems, not other policies that would be more likely to address the problem, such as Medicare for All. In addition, the interim framework admits that, quote, communities of color, particularly black populations, may be more wary of officials responsible for vaccine-related decisions due to past medical injustices committed by authorities on black communities, end quote. There is a long list of these medical injustices committed against minority communities by the U.S. government, including the infamous Tuskegee syphilis experiments, which are discussed in detail later. Another odd passage on justice and equity as it relates to vaccinating ethnic minorities first states, in the context of vaccine allocation, treating individuals fairly has sometimes been defined as treating everyone the same or equally, for example, by distributing vaccines on a first-come, first-served basis, or by giving everyone an equal chance at getting vaccine via a lottery. Because the impact of the vaccine is different for different people, i.e., some people are at greater risk of death, the straightforward ways of treating people equally are often reflected as unfair or as an inefficient use of vaccine. In the context of vaccine allocation, promoting equity and social justice requires addressing higher rates of COVID-19 related severe illness and mortality among systematically disadvantaged or marginalized groups. As a matter of justice, these disparities in COVID-19 risk and adverse outcomes across racial and ethnic groups should be addressed in our overall COVID-19 response. This extreme emphasis on the fairness and justice of prioritizing minorities for the vaccine is contradicted by other claims made in the same document. For example, the document also states, the ultimate safety of an approved vaccine is not completely knowable until it has been administered to millions of people. Wow, that's encouraging. During clinical trials, tens of thousands of individuals will receive the vaccine, but that may fail to show safety concerns that occur with less frequency, such as 1 in 1 million. 1 in a million. This can be a concern for particularly severe adverse effects. It also notes it is possible that certain adverse effects may occur more frequently in certain population subgroups, which may not be apparent until millions are vaccinated. Notably, African Americans are understood to be at a higher risk for adverse reactions to vaccines. According to a study by the University of Pennsylvania, African Americans exhibit a disproportionately higher immune response to certain flu shots. And in 2014, the Mayo Clinic found that African Americans have almost double the immune response to the rubella vaccine as Caucasian Americans. Immune reactions that are too strong can result in more adverse events and inflammatory responses, such as transverse myelitis, a debilitating inflammation and paralysis of the spinal cord. Oh, that's not problematic. A 2010 study in the Journal of Toxicology and Environmental Health showed that African American boys were at significantly greater risk of suffering severe neurological injury from the hepatitis B shot as compared to Caucasians. This raises the question as to whether African Americans should be prioritized for a poorly tested vaccine when the available science shows that this demographic may be at a higher risk for adverse reactions to vaccines. Previous coronavirus vaccine projects triggered immune responses so strong that the test animals died and the vaccine projects got scrapped. The Johns Hopkins CHS interim framework, claiming that vaccinating African Americans and other ethnic minorities first represents fairness and justice and would address structural racism, does not square with its admission that the safety of the COVID-19 vaccine is, quote, not completely knowable, end quote, until millions have received it, and that certain adverse effects may occur more frequently in certain population subgroups. Who is really to blame for vaccine hesitancy? For a successful rollout of a COVID-19 vaccine, the federal government will need to reckon with vaccine hesitancy, which the WHO named as one of the top 10 threats to global health in 2019, and which is a major concern discussed at length in the August interim framework on COVID-19 vaccination strategies. I'm going to leave it here, and this is going to be a two-parter. All right. To be continued.